In contrast to the Sumerians and Hittites, the history of the Gokturks is far less controversial, being accepted by all without contradiction as part of Turkish history. Well, by most people. These steppe warriors once founded in the 6th century the first state that bore the designation Turk in its name, and at the same time also the largest steppe empire in Eurasia up to that time. Only the Mongols would manage to surpass the Gokturks. However, hardly anyone knows their history. There is very little literature on the Gokturks, at least in the West. Also, video documentaries are not to be found. Therefore, last summer I made my own documentary on the Gokturks in film length and uploaded it on this channel. The translations were well received, but especially the German version is very popular, over 100,000 viewers. And the English version has also gained a lot of momentum within the past 2 weeks. The film attracted more interested people within a few months than the short summary of the Gokturks I published in 2020 did in a whole year. I want to thank you guys for that. You encouraged me to keep going at a point where I had almost gave up. It is true that the upcoming projects will broaden this channel's view of Turkic history. For example, a film on the Mamluks of Egypt will be released on Christmas Eve. Nevertheless, the history of the Gokturks is far from over. This film was in fact the first part of a trilogy I am working on. At the moment I am producing part 2. After the downfall of the first Göktürk Kaganate, there was more or less chaos all over Eurasia. Many new states like those of the Khazars and the Turk Shahi had emerged, but could never live up to the claims of the Göktürks. After 50 years, the Ashina dynasty returned to the world stage and established Kaganate No. 2. However, this interregnum period is important for understanding Turkic peoples, because the Turks' influence in the world increased precisely because a power vacuum had been created that could be filled, at least in part, by other Turkic dynasties. The new, second Kaganate of Ilturish, Tanyukuk, Bilge Khan and company will be finally dealt with next year in part 3 of the trilogy. But if you look at the comments on the film in different languages, you see many misunderstandings on the part of the viewers. The Göktürk film was not meant to be just an introduction to the trilogy, covering the events from 546 to 630 chronologically. On the contrary, the first 15 minutes of the video are about the origin of the Turks in general, their ancient culture, religion and spread thereof. Nevertheless, there are obviously still many prejudices and misunderstandings. Of course, I can't let it stay like that. One of the biggest misunderstandings concerns the origin of the Göktürks. The thesis that the Göktürks were not real Turks at all can be traced back to the prehistory of the Göktürk Kaganate. As is known, the empire came into being when a certain Turk named Buman rebelled against his overlord, the Ruran Khagan, in 546, defeated him in 2 battles, and then took power himself. Buman left the Ruran administration untouched, but installed his family members from the Ashina clan in the high positions of the state. And he proclaimed himself Khagan. His brother Istami expanded the empire to present-day Ukraine. And Buman's sons maintained and expanded the wealth and influence of the Göktürks. But Göktürk does not designate all Turkic peoples who lived in the empire at that time, only the Ashina dynasty. However, since the Ashina under their own banner practically united all the Turkic tribes that existed in the world at that time, it is believed by some that they had all ruled over the empire together. It is true that the number of rebellions in the Kaganate was practically 0, until the civil war of the 580s, so this suggests broad agreement among the other Turks toward Ashina rule. But first and foremost, all Turks in the empire were subject to the Khagan. And the Khagan was elected by the Ashina family. But were the Ashina themselves Turkic? They spoke the ancient Turkic language, yes. And since they were as gifted steppe warriors as the Xiongnu Huns before them, the Chinese assumed that the Ashina clan was a successor tribe to the Huns. The Huns were a confederation of different ethnic groups, but we know that there were Turkic-speaking people who had taken on important roles in the upper class of the Xiongnu Confederation. So there certainly was a Turkic influence among the Huns. But the names of the Ashina reveal something else. Bumin, Istami, Mukun, Tasper. Names of great Göktürk rulers that sound nothing at all like other ancient Turkic names I have listed here alongside. Turkologists like Peter B. Golden conclude that the Ashina rulers bore names that would indicate Indo-Iranian or Aryan origin. The Ashina were Aryans? This seems totally absurd, because why would a non-Turkic clan, of all things, suddenly become so popular among Turks, much less emphasize Turk identity on its own? Before their arrival at the Altay, the Ashina clan had lived in the Turfan Basin, near the Aryan Wusun. And the Wusun and Ashina both shared the legend about a wolf being their mythical ancestor. It is therefore likely that this was a kinsman tribe that then fled from a Chinese invasion to the area where Turks had lived for centuries. If we take the newest studies of the Max Planck Institute at the University of Jena to assistance, this contradicts the origin of the Turkic language, which is to have developed in Northeast Asia. If Turks, Japanese and Koreans had their common origin in Manchuria, how did the Ashina from the Turfan Basin fit into the picture? Now, one answer could be that they simply do not. The Ashina appeared out of nowhere, not inventing Turkic identity, but being the very first ever to make it visible on the world stage. They worshipped the same god as all other Turks. They practiced the same rites and traditions as all other Turks. And as I said, they spoke the same language. Doesn't that then make the Ashina also Turks, irrespective to their supposed non-Turk origin? This might be the point. The Göktürk kaganate was multicultural. But this does not mean the pejorative term multiculti, as our German viewers might know it, but an organic coming together of many different cultures, which were not so different at all, actually. The Ashina ruled over the empire. The Teal Federation, a union of many ancient Turkic tribes, fought for the empire. The Iranian-origin Sogdians traded for the empire. And all other Turkic tribes and state-like entities formed the foundation on which the empire was built. It was precisely the versatility of the kaganate that distinguished it massively from all other great empires, namely the Byzantines, Persians and Chinese, even though they were certainly multicultural as well to a certain extent. But there is a study that contradicts the idea of a non-Turkic origin of the Ashina. It was conducted in 2015 by Chinese genetic scientists. Samples from the Ashina clan were studied. The Ashide were the second powerful clan in the Göktürk Kaghanate. They were closely related to the Ashina, and represented the princesses and queens of the empire. Thus, the marriage of an Ashide woman to an Ashina man regulated the stability of their joint rule. For example, the mother of An Lushan, a general of the Chinese Tang dynasty who instigated a devastating rebellion against the Tang emperor in the 8th century, had also been a member of the Ashide. The Ashide had a significant part in the Ilturish Kaghan rebellion against the Chinese. Presumably, this clan did not call itself Ashide, but Kutlug. The genetic samples then support the implication that both clans were very much tribes of Turkic origin. The result is that the Ashide were part of haplogroup Q, more precisely subgroup Q1a L53, which corresponds to subgroup Q1a2. And this group has been found in other studies in populations in Central Asia and Siberia. This map shows the general distribution of haplogroup Q. The darker the color, the more often it was found within the population. The fact that all of America, with reference to the native inhabitants, the Indians, is part of this group, I leave without comment. After the emigration of the today's Indians about 10,000 years ago from Asia over the Bering Strait, this is not a big surprise. but it shows us that the Ashide also had their origin in the area from Central Asia to Siberia, probably in Northeast Asia. This is the place, which was described in the study of the University of Jena as the original homeland of the ancient Turks, Japanese and Koreans. Ashide and Ashina were not one and the same tribe, but so closely related that this Northeast Asian origin can be assumed for the Ashina as well. For another genetic study, this time by Russian scientists, has shown that the Ashina belonged to haplogroup R1a, which was also found among the Turkic Salurs, Uyghurs, and Yakuts. The subgroup shared by these Turkic peoples occurred particularly in the region of southern Siberia, including the Altai. Regardless of which culture the names of the first few rulers may have been influenced by, the Ashina were as deeply rooted in ancient Turkic culture as were all the other Turkic tribes in Eurasia in late antiquity. Possibly they had migrated south in antiquity, after the Huns had fragmented, and then returned to the Altai around 436 or 439, where they were once again surrounded by their proper kin. The prehistory of the Göktürks is thus finally clarified. The prehistory of the Ashina and Ashide, however, exists only in fragments. Perhaps also this chapter will be cleared up sometime, with the help of the genetic research. Until then, we can say the following. The Gokturks were originally Turkic, both originally and during the Kaganate period. Language, tradition, customs and even their genes do not allow any other conclusion. Even if this may be tempting for certain amateur historians in Europe.